Thank you very much for the invitation to give this lecture. It is a great honor to speak under the name of Dr. Surin Pitsuwan, who was a good friend and someone both of us admire enormously as a scholar, as a politician, as a statesman, and as a humanist. He should have been UN Secretary General, and he should have had more time.
In September and October of last year, Chiang Mai and other urban centres in northern Thailand were badly flooded. The press called these events unprecedented, which was not strictly true. Older residents can recall that the centre of Chiang Mai occasionally flooded in the monsoon in the past. But two features were new. First, the water rose surprisingly fast, reaching waist level or more in a few hours. And second, the waters, as you can see, carried a very large amount of silt, of mud, which was very difficult to clean up. The causes are complicated and cumulative. Climate change is making the monsoon more erratic, and there has been a rising trend of localized flooding in Thailand from unusually high rainfall for some time. And rising temperatures have induced more forest fires, which have diminished tree cover. Plus, a boom in growing maize on the hill slopes has further reduced tree cover and damaged the soils. As a result, heavy rain caused rapid silt-laden runoff, which the rivers carried from the hills into the cities. Perhaps also water gates along the Ping River had been poorly maintained and could not be opened to divert the excess. These floods were thus a lesson on the importance of managing natural resources of land, trees, and water in the new context of climate change. The focus of this talk is on changes in forest policy resulting from climate change, from the physical impact, but also the indirect impact on the regime of knowledge surrounding policy making. First, we set these events into their historical context, including the great deforestation of the 20th century. Then we look at the ideas that have framed state policy on forest and the causes of conflict and violence over the past generation. And finally, we look at how climate change is changing the debate by bringing mud and smoke from the hills to the city, and by changing the actors, the concerns, and the data.
200 years ago, some 80 to 90% of modern Thailand was still covered with forest. The tropical temperature and monsoon rainfall generated dense biomass, which hosted wild animals and fatal diseases. People saw the forest as dangerous, and they clustered in cities and towns. The population remained very sparse because of forest disease and warfare. Maybe 4 to 5 million people at the start of the 19th century. But forests were never empty of people. They were a refuge, a somnia, for those escaping authority and slavery. They were also a haven for people driven south by the destruction of the forest in China, which had begun several millennia earlier and had intensified since 1700. Today's hill tribes in north of Thailand are the products of these two movements. Even now, the hills are a refuge. In 1999, we visited a village in Chayapum threatened by a dam project. The villagers were supposedly Chawbon or Niyaku, who are remnants of a very old Mon Khmer people. But after talking to them, we found that many of them were actually lowland Thai Lao, and some coming from places as close as Lopburi, in flight from authority and modernity.
Thailand's forests were then destroyed at extraordinary speed. Modern medicine removed the restraints on population growth, first with cholera treatments around 1900, and especially with DDT and malaria vaccines from around 1950. So the population inside the borders of Thailand, modern Thailand, multiplied over 10 times in 1 century. Peasant settlers spread rice cultivation across the lowlands, then dry crops of cassava, maize and soybean on the uplines, soft fruit on the lower slopes of the hills, and opium on the tops. Loggers helpfully removed the trees, and finally in the Cold War, the army joined in the destruction to deny havens to communist rebels. They built roads into the forests, which were convenient for loggers' trucks, and they imported communities, including some Hmong, originally from southern China and Laos. So forest cover was reduced to about 60% by 1950, then half of that disappeared in the space of a single generation. Put it in context, the same proportion that China lost over the last millennium was destroyed in Thailand in 30 years.
In parallel with this great deforestation, the state adopted 3 key ideas on how forests should be managed. First, from the colonial world came the idea that forests belong to the state and should be managed by bureaucratic methods. The Royal Forestry Department, or in short the RFD, has created in 1896 on a British Indian colonial model. The Forest Land Act of 1941 defined forests as a residual, namely any area that was not covered by a land ownership title and under the control of the government. Second, from the USA National Park movement came the idea of forests as wilderness, empty of resident people, but sometimes can be partially accessible for recreation. This idea underlay the National Parks Act of 1961 and the first park in Khao Yai in 1962. As head of the RFD, sum up his idea very bluntly: man cannot coexist with the forest. Third, J.N. Dunhoff, a Dutch colonial forester who visited Thailand in 1948, proposed that Thailand should set a target of 40% of total area for forest cover. In origin, this figure was a rough rule of thumb, but once imported to Thailand, it was codified in national plans and forest legislation.
Significantly, all 3 of these guiding concepts came from outside, particularly from the colonial world. This was a very deliberate attempt to displace local knowledge on forest management. The forest dwellers, who might have had different ideas, were denounced as hill tribes, who were of course not really Thai, and who destroyed forests by slash and burn, a phrase packed with violence. State policy thus aimed to have forests covering 40% of the country empty of people and under centralized bureaucratic control. As the great deforestation tailed off in the 1980s, government began to realize this vision. It defined some areas as watershed forest, in which settlement was illegal, justified on grounds of protecting water supplies, and others as protected areas for conservation. By 1990, there were around 150 parks and reserves, covering 13% of total land area. And by 2000, this had expanded to over 400 protected areas, covering about 23% of total area, with plans for further expansion. And the official total area defined as forest hovered close to the magic figure of 40%.
But there was difficulty. Within the area defined as forest, there were a lot of people, perhaps 10 million, perhaps more. Some had been there for a long time. Their villages appear on century-old maps, had a Buddhist wat and government school. Others had come as peasant settlers during the state promotion of commercial agriculture in the mid-20th century. Others had been settled very recently by the army as part of the anti-communist campaign, and often promised secure tenure, but nothing came of it. In 2020, according to government, there are communities living in every one of the 227 major protected areas, a total of 4,265 villages.
There was thus a massive gap between the state vision of forests empty of people and the reality of forests providing residence and livelihood for millions. And that gap was a cause of conflict and dispute. The authorities, which meant the army and the RFD, wanted to remove the people but didn't know where to take them. The villagers wanted rights to stay and to make their livelihood. So disputes multiplied. This chart shows only the cases registered in the first 20 years of this century. In total, at the present, there are over 40,000 disputes pending, mostly about occupation and use of land, defined officially as forest. The forest communities countered the state's imported discourse on forest management, centralized control, empty wilderness, 40%, by explaining their expertise on forest management resulting from long experience in this location with these trees in this climate. This discourse was especially associated with the Karen, the Pakaya'o, but was shared, in fact, by many groups. Some academics slated this Karen consensus as a romantic fantasy, but after trekking a day through a forest in Chiang Mai with the Karen leader Joni Odonchao, which is about 20 years ago, who greeted every other tree like a friend and told of their care and their use, we think the idea deserves respect. Ajahn Chi, Suwichan Patana Praiwan, a Pakaya'o activist, poet, singer, and professor of environmental studies in a Bangkok university, argues it this way. Where are Thailand's remaining forests? Along the western border. Where do the Karen live? Along the western border. To explain their methods of forest management, the communities translated them into the language and performance of bureaucratic state management. They divided the forest into zones, drafted maps, drew up lists of rules, and put up signage about all of this. And they also pushed to legitimize their practice through legislation, a community forest bill. And they got help from sympathetic activists, NGOs, academics, and media people to present their ideas in public space and to agitate, especially through the Assembly of the Poor in the late 1990s.
But ideas require power to become action. The power was in the hand of the RFD and the army. A head of the RFD said bluntly, "You can live in the forest if you live like barbarians, but now your life is civilized and we have no more forest left. You have to go." The army moved some communities by force. In the 1980s, there were several reports of villages being burned to the ground. In 1990, the army launched a plan titled Kochagor to move 9,700 villages with 6 million people out of the forest areas, provoking pitched battles, notably in Buriram province, and big protests elsewhere, including a march on Bangkok along the Mitrapark Highway. In 1992, the army was forced from power and had to scrap the scheme. We did a study on this. But the Royal Forestry Department continued to move people, often violently. One particular case became very public.
In 1997, the army and the forest officers moved villagers away from a village called Bangloy or Jaipendin which is a long settled village deep in the Gengajan National Park along the western border. The villages were given other land and promised citizenship, but the land was useless and the citizenship never materialized, so they quietly moved back. In 2011, the authorities moved them down again, and this time burnt their houses and granaries and arrested several for destroying the forest. In response, a village elder sued the forest department and its chief. In April 2014, Billy Polaji Ratchongjaran, a young poet, singer and activist who had helped the elder lodge the case, disappeared. In 2019, charred bone fragments found in an oil drum inside the park were matched to his mother's DNA. The police filed a case of attempted murder and forced disappearance against the park chief and others, but the major charges were dropped. The chief was found guilty only of corruption and misconduct, sentenced to 3 years in jail, but then reprieved and restored to an important post in the forest department. Some villagers again then moved back to their original site, but were again moved down in 2021, and several of them were arrested and charged at court.
The situation remained unchanged for a generation. The numbers of people living in forests did not significantly diminish. The actual tree cover did not significantly increase. The disputes mounted up. The violence continued. This has not been good for neither people nor the trees. Some began to search for compromises which would benefit both people and trees.
In the 1990s, forest officers in some localities enlisted the help of local communities in preserving and expanding the tree cover, and in return allowed them to practice some livelihood activities. In 1998, the RFD formalized these arrangements in a forest community registration program, and by 2018, over 11,000 villages occupying almost 1 million hectares had registered for the program, and thus enjoyed some use rights for food, fodder, fuel, wood and construction materials. In 2018, the Deputy Director of RFD estimated there was still over 10 million people living on over 3 million hectares within the official forest, but he now argued the government should treat these residents as allies in forest management rather than chasing them away. Academics promoted schemes of agroforestry, which would allow commercial agriculture to coexist with tree cover. Coffee production proved rather successful, and by 2020, Thai hill tribe coffee had earned a cachet in the international market. But these attempts at compromise were sporadic and piecemeal until the issue of climate change intruded into the debate.
Climate change has made the politics of the forest more complex and more important. It has changed the whole basis of the debate and brought in new interests and actors. The first of these new interests is the planet itself. Tropical forests are vital as carbon sinks. They are relatively easy to create compared to the alternatives because of the way biomass grows in a tropical monsoon climate, and they are under threat all over the world because of the immediate profits when they are converted to agriculture, and of course because they are vulnerable to rising temperatures too. Southeast Asia has a significant percentage of the remaining area of tropical forests still.
The potential of the forests as carbon sinks has been important to the Thai government in developing commitments under the Paris Accords of 2015. The Climate Change Master Plan of 2015 to 2050 repeated the aim to increase forest coverage to 40% of the total national territory, in line with the old way of thinking. But other promises were very different. The state undertook to support the role of local communities in the conservation of forests and ecosystems, to promote transparent and sustainable public participation in forest conservation, and to give explicit recognition of community rights to forest resources. This was a break from the dogma of central control and empty forests, and it signalled that government agencies other than the RFD and the Army had got an interest in forest policy. The government's subsequent commitments on carbon emissions under the Paris Accords depended partly on expanding the forested area. And the forests thus have potential for government to get funding under climate finance schemes and for private enterprise to earn income on the international carbon market. But the advocates of empty forests countered by justifying further extension of protected areas, which was supposed to be empty of people, as a means to expand tree cover and especially to create the large contiguous areas of forest needed to preserve biodiversity.
The second result of climate change was that the city became interested in the forest itself. As the debates and conflicts over forests multiply in the late 20th century, the mainstream urban middle class showed little interest. For them, forests were areas of backwardness and danger, outside their interest in modernity and prosperity. This began to change at the very end of the century. As the cities became bigger, more crowded, and hotter, the urban middle class looked to the hills for recreation. Upland areas within easy reach of the cities, such as the perimeter of Khao Yai near Bangkok or various areas around Chiang Mai, sprouted resorts, camp, farm stays, spas, and glamping sites. The hills thus also became an opportunity for urban investment in tourism, sold to both local and foreign visitors. In a handful of years in the 2010s, a beautiful ridge of Phuthapburg in Phetchabun was swamped with illegal resorts. In 2016, government ordered the demolition of 64 illegally built resorts and laid charges against 100 entrepreneurs, but the remainder continued to operate. In a single decade, over 100 golf courses appeared. Golf courses need a lot of land. Many were built in areas of degraded forest. Often, this required some trickery to circumvent the laws. We shall come back to this later.
The issue that really focused urban attention on the climate, air pollution. From 1997, smoke occasionally spread north from forest fires in Sumatra and initially reached Bangkok for only short periods. The haze gradually worsened and by 2007 had become an annual event. And in 2019, when the air pollution in Thailand was declared the worst in the world, government made it a priority issue. Several factors contributed to the haze. First, there is traffic, industry, and construction in the urban areas themselves. Second, there are more natural forest fires caused by the rising global temperature within Thailand and adjacent areas of Myanmar and Laos. Third, there is crop burning, especially of sugarcane and maize. Beginning in the 1990s, there was a big expansion of maize growing, mostly under contract farming, especially in the hilly areas of the north and often at the expense of forest cover. Maize is attractive to agribusiness because of the rising global demand for animal feed and for biofuels. Maize is attractive to small-scale farmers because it grows in rain-fed conditions and on hill slopes and is relatively cheap as investment. But maize has a complication, particularly when grown on hillsides. It cannot be harvested by machine, and the farmers generally burn the plants after harvest. The big boom in maize has subsided in the last few years, but large areas still remain.
The haze was especially acute in Chiang Mai, where it affected the health of large number of people and had a major impact on tourism because it was worse at the peak season for international tourists. Civic groups demanded action. In 2014, several government agencies, including the RFD, along with civic groups, tourism operators, NGOs, forest communities, and representatives of agribusiness, convened to debate the problem. The Electricity Authority of Thailand also became involved after finding that soil erosion in the hills resulted in silting at its hydroelectric plants. Never before had such a range of actors thrust themselves into the making of forest policy. These discussions identify nearby Madjam district as a major source of the pollution and a site for a model solution.
This district was a microcosm of forest issues. 99% of the area had been classified as national park or reserved forest, but over 50,000 people were living there. The district had become a major site of maize growing promoted by agribusiness, especially by the CP Group, Thailand's largest corporation. The RFD wanted to evict the villagers, but the Karen countered that they could manage the forest better. In 2014, the government agencies and the village representatives agreed a short-term plan to minimize the haze by developing water resources to moisten the forest and deploying villagers as forest guards against fires. And they also set out a long-term plan to transition away from maize to agroforestry and to regenerate the forest. By 2016, the fires were considered under control because of the policing. And the think tank TDRI hailed the event as a win-win for everyone. They wrote, "The environmental impact is impressive. The forests are returning, serving as carbon sinks to alleviate climate change. Such local efforts help significantly save the country's resources in tackling environmental problems." And the agribusiness giant CP touted its involvement in the scheme as part of its corporate social responsibility efforts. In 2019, the Prime Minister, General Prayut, officially lauded the Madjam model and promised to apply it elsewhere. And the public TV station, PBS, aired programs portraying Madjam as a model of sustainable development. This was an unprecedented event in the politics of Thailand's forest in several ways. First, it involved a much broader range of interests than ever before. Second, it focused on the question of how best to manage the forest to prevent fires and preserve forest cover. And third, it recognized that the forest communities had to be part of the answer, and thus their livelihood had to be brought into consideration.
The third effect of the climate change came in the realm of data and the terms of the debate. More satellites have been launched to monitor the state of the planet. Satellite imagery and sophisticated software have become available to researchers. NASA made data available from 2016. The Thai government develops its own GISTA site. Anyone can look up several hotspot sites showing where forest sites are burning in real time. So researchers can trace changes in forest cover over time. Issues that earlier were debated in claim and counterclaim, ideology and antithesis are now subject to quantitative analysis. We will give just two examples.
One study of Nan province from 2000 to 2019 showed that as a result of the maize boom, the area under forest cover shrank from 90 to 75% of the province, quite a fall. But areas defined as community forests were able to retain forest cover significantly better than areas of protected forest or residual forest under the RFD. The authors concluded that, all other things being equal, forests were about 3 times less likely to be cleared in community forests located in national forests compared to their surrounding forests in national forests, in other words, those directly under the RFD. Several other studies have yielded similar results, but all are vulnerable to the criticism that they are case studies and possibly non-representative. One larger project studied almost 1,200 forest areas across the country over the years 2000 to 2017. The study measured the incidence of forest fires and the change in forest cover, comparing community forests with areas directly under RFD. The study found that forests with more extensive community forestry are significantly more likely to have proportionately greater area of forest cover and lesser fire incidence and intensity. Moreover, this was the surprise, the beneficial effect of community forestry spilled over into adjacent areas inside national parks and other protected areas. And the authors surmised that somehow better forest conditions in community forest can create better environment for natural regeneration and recolonization of forest into the nearby national park. And the author concluded by more or less saying, if you give the communities living in the forest an interest in the future of the forest and their own future, then this kind of program is going to work. But the issue of power remains critical. Through coups in 2006 and 2014, the army returned to a dominant position in Thailand's politics. And the army has seized on forest policy as one major way to assert a role in Thai society that is broader than the conventional military role. In 2014, the army announced its own forestry master plan. And this plan repeated the goal of 40% forest cover, reasserted the need for central control, and defined areas with resident communities as crisis zones that had to be cleared as quickly as possible. Just 4 days after the coup in 2014, soldiers returned to the village in Buriram, which they had had to quit in 1992, 22 years earlier, and resumed their attempts to evict the 500 families. Similar incidents appeared elsewhere, many of them very violent and provoking a huge wave of protests around this time. The Mer Gem project was caught in the crossfire. Villagers expected that their cooperation would be rewarded with land rights, but the RFD wanted to reclaim all the land occupied since 2002 and allow only limited title on the remainder. The authorities continued to pressure communities to move and arrested those that refused, and the villagers responded by ceasing to police the forest fires. The haze returned with a vengeance in 2019-2020 and stayed thereafter. Somkiat Mitbem, a local activist, commented, "If the officials believe they can look after the forest by themselves, let them." This is what the local villagers feel. Land rights and community-based forest conservation is the answer, yet power and prejudice prevail. So when in last year Chiang Mai city was hit by flash floods, which appeared with unprecedented speed, some attributed this to the rapid runoff from the denuded hills and eroded soils of Mer Gem and adjacent districts.
To sum up, at the end of the Cold War and Great Deforestation, the two agencies in charge of the forest, the Army and the RFD, developed a vision of forests empty of people, while in reality, forests were home and livelihood for several millions of people. The authority wanted to move people out, but the communities wanted rights to occupy and stay. The result was tens of thousands of disputes. Over the subsequent 4 decades, there have been countless reports, inquiries, books, theses, legislative acts, and cabinet resolutions, but in practice, the basic situation has not changed very much. The tangle remains. Let us now end with 5 key points.
First, climate change has made a difference in 2 main ways. It has brought new figures into the debate. These include government agencies other than the Army and RFD, and urban groups who have learnt that they are more vulnerable than before to haze and flood, that they thus have an interest in having the forest better managed, and they need to act to make that happen. Second, the more intense monitoring of the planet has made data and techniques available which allow measurement to replace rhetoric in the debates on forest management. The Medjem affair was one of many new initiatives that appeared in the 2010s, especially in the north, but also in parts of the northeast and the south. This year, the exceptionally bad pollution in Bangkok in January and February and the resulting urban anger forced the government to craft a national policy on air quality, including a ban on all burning of maize and sugarcane, which was pretty stupid because they couldn't possibly enforce it. There are still many barriers, particularly the continued involvement of the army and its rigid approach, and the influence of mega agribusiness over government, but there is some light at the end of the tunnel. Third, but how to resolve the tangle? While the debate on forest management at the macro level has been deadlocked, in many localities there has been more flexibility and compromise, and these examples show the way ahead. There needs to be a transition away from the centralized and authoritarian control of forest management through decentralization and participation. But we can see this will not be easy, as the Medjem experience has shown. Much will depend on how Thailand moves away from military rule to democratic processes over the coming years.
Fourth, this talk is a spin-off from a broader project about land governance or land policy at the national level. That project concluded that land governance is a source of conflict and inefficiency, largely because Thailand has not one but 3 systems of land governance. Land under full title in Thai called Chanod. Second, government-owned land, including the forests and parks. And third, land reform or Sopakor land, which has a restricted title. Each type has its own laws and rules and its own agencies. This is confusing, inefficient, and wasteful. It allows for massive corruption and abuse. Shifting a plot from one system to another can easily inflate its price enormously. A leading national politician is currently under investigation over his golf course. He can show that he bought the land with a full title deed, but the government maps show that the course is inside the land reform area reserved for agriculture only.
And this is not at all unusual. A few years ago, government launched a project titled One Map to create one map showing the title status of every square inch of land. But when the totals under the different systems were added up, they came to 465 million rai, which is rather more than the actual total of 320 million rai. In short, over a third of all land has overlapping claims. And this situation needs to be rationalized by moving towards a system of land governments which is more unified but less centralized, allowing more scope for participation and local variation. Fifth, climate change is here now and ever changing. Only a few years ago, the reports of the UN IPCC directed our attention to changes in the planet expected by the end of the 21st century, which seemed a long way away. But we then learned that the early phases can have significant impact, largely in the form of extreme weather events, including hurricanes in the Caribbean, flooding in the cities of India and China, forest fires in California and Greece, and desiccation of areas of Africa. And we have then learned that climate change has multiple impacts which can combine in unexpected ways, so that the 2022 floods in Pakistan were the combined result of a supercharged monsoon, an unusual southward surge of cold air from China, and abnormally high glacial melt in the Indus River, all three causes related to climate change, but in different ways. We next learned that the impact of climate change is also shaped by environmental history. The recent burning of Los Angeles came from a combination of climatic factors and an urban design based on a vision of leafy suburbia from northern Europe, realized in a zone which is by nature a desert and becoming more so. And the flooding in Spain came from the combination of exceptional rainfall, a year's total in 8 hours, with urban design evolved in medieval times and then overbuilt and invaded by the motor car.
The physical changes in climate have immediate and dramatic impact on society, on how people conduct their lives and make a livelihood. These social impacts have political consequences by mobilizing people behind new agendas and by reframing the debate with new ideas and new data. This study of the forest is just one example. There are similar stories about the rivers, the coastline, the cities, and so on. This spiral of new and unexpected events and combinations will continue. Climate change is now a factor in our everyday lives and an unavoidably aspect of how we study society and politics today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.